Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. On this episode, I'm going to be exploring something that you will all have heard of: mental health. Now, it's finally entered the mainstream. After years of being ignored, stigmatised or quietly brushed aside, mental health is something we hear about regularly in the media, in politics, in schools, and increasingly in the workplace. We're being encouraged to speak more openly about it, to check in on each other, to normalise the idea that not feeling okay is actually okay. And that's progress. But it also raises a deeper question. Now that we've acknowledged mental health matters, what do we actually do with that knowledge? Because recognising that mental health is important is not the same as understanding how it works. And offering support is not the same as embedding it. For all the talk of resilience, burnout, and psychological safety, the way many organisations approach mental health often feels oddly disconnected from how people actually experience it. All too often, well-being is treated as something to be managed on the sidelines, with HR initiatives, digital wellness platforms, or one-off campaigns. It's often reactive, surface level, and let's be honest, at times performative, designed more to signal care than to actually provide it. But what if there was a better way? What if mental health wasn't seen as a problem to fix when things go wrong, but as something to understand, nurture, and proactively design for, just like any other aspect of performance or culture? That's the premise behind a new book called Wellbeing Intelligence, written by my guests Dr. Kiran Bhatti and Professor Thomas Roulet. Kiran is a counselling psychologist who works directly with people dealing with stress, trauma, and anxiety, and Thomas is an organisational psychologist at Cambridge Judge Business School, part of the university, whose research explores how people and institutions navigate complexities. Now, long-time listeners might remember him from a previous episode in 2020, where we discussed his research into the surprising upside of stigma and negative perception. There's a link to that in the show notes. Together, as partners in life and in thought, Kiran and Thomas have created a compelling and deeply practical framework that brings the clinical and the organisational into conversation. And in the book, they argue that supporting mental health isn't about grand gestures or crisis interventions. It's about paying attention to the small signals and designing systems that make it easier to ask for help and building cultures where people feel safe enough to be real. In our discussion, we explore why most mental health programs at work fall short, how everyday stress accumulates invisibly, and what organisations can do, beyond the buzzwords, to support people in ways that actually work. This was a really fascinating conversation, and in a Human Risk podcast first, we are also joined by their newborn baby, who arrived just as the book was being completed. Now, you won't hear much from the baby, but somehow it still adds an extra layer and seems hugely on brand for the conversation that we're going to have. It's my discussion with Dr. Kiran Bhatti and Professor Thomas Roulet on Wellbeing Intelligence. Thomas, welcome back to the Human Risk podcast, and Kiran, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
I'm so excited to have you both here, and this has been quite an incredible period for you. So you have delivered one thing, which is you have had your first child, so congratulations on that. But you're also about to deliver something else together, which is a book called Wellbeing Intelligence. Kiran, why don't we start with you and say, why did you decide to write this book with your husband?
Oh, that's a really good question, actually. So Thomas came to me with the idea of wanting to do something with mental health and workplace. And I think, so by background, I'm a counselling psychologist. So typically what happens when you're a psychologist in a relationship is you end up talking about mental health, usually with your spouse, trying to sort of sort out their mental health indirectly. And he was sort of talking about lots of issues at work and things that were happening with his students. And I was finding the same thing in my own workplace. So we sort of naturally ended up talking about a lot of workplace mental health difficulties and things that we were seeing, especially following lockdown, and thought there was something in there, something about sort of bringing both of our expertise together to create something that might be useful for lots of people.
Thomas, you've been on the show before, so listeners will obviously know who you are, and I will point them to that previous episode in the show notes. But how does this fit in to being professor at business school? Because it's not the sort of topic I would expect.
So you may remember last time I came on the show, it was about negative social evaluation. So one of my specialty is stigma. And from stigma, I went on to working on stigma around mental health. And for the last decade or so, I have produced papers looking at mental health as an outcome of organizational interventions. So, what can we set up in organizations that actually has a positive impact on people's mental health? When is it that it works and when is it that it doesn't work? And what I discovered at the dinner table, every night when I return home and Kiran and I are having dinner before we had a child, which now is keeping us quite busy. So we don't have any conversation at the dinner table anymore. But what I discovered is that while from an organizational perspective, as a sociologist, we see mental health as a generic outcome. But from the perspective of counseling psychologists, there are a lot of methods, a lot of practices that people can engage with that can have a significant impact on their mental health. So we talk a lot about those techniques in the book, like cognitive behavioral therapy, all of those levers. And then I thought there is a missed opportunity because in my field, we know that mental health is important. And in Kiran's field, we know that it's important, but we also have practical tools to try to address it at the individual level. And that can inform managers and the way they work with others in organizations.
And so this is an interesting shift, I guess, from saying it matters for individuals, obviously, but it also matters for the success of organizations, which I guess in simple terms is a collection of individuals.
Yes, absolutely. There is a lot of research showing that well-being is a driver of organizational performance, but not only that, it is a driver of employer brand. It is a driver of being able to attract people in your organization. It is important for risk. I know that you talk a lot about risk and compliance in your podcast. Well, if people are not well, if they are struggling with their mental health, there will be implications, with regards to risk taking, risk aversion. So the well-being element is an important individual level outcomes that has organizational impact.
And so who's the book for?
Good question. Do you want to take this one?
So we've sort of talked about it being mental health and well-being in the workplace. So we're thinking individuals, anybody in some sort of work at the individual level, but we also kind of think it's a really important book for team members, for managers, for leaders. So it can be sort of applied to anybody. And actually, as we were writing this, obviously, Thomas, in academia, we were thinking even, research supervisors and PhD students, any sort of relationship where you're working and you're around people, it can be sort of applied to. But yeah, so it is focused around sort of workplace mental health, but actually a lot of the tools that we've used, because as Thomas says, they've come from psychology, used on individuals in lots of circumstances, we could probably apply it in lots of places.
Yes, and I will add that obviously there is an element that is about the self. So in the book, there are lots of practices that people can apply to help their own stress and mental health, whether they are just an employee with no managerial role, but also there are lots of techniques and a lot of practical tools that people can use to help others in the workplace, but also to inform the well-being strategies of their organization and to have practices and interventions that are effective at the organizational level.
And you start in the most obvious place, right? Which is that in order to do, if whatever you're trying to do within an organization, obviously you've got to start with yourself, right? It's going to be very, very difficult to deliver this for other people if you're not yourself in the right place. And so as you looked at that, I mean, that's a huge topic to sort of distill down, particularly as you're looking at both the broad range of challenges. How did you go about kind of distilling this really big topic?
I think we looked around us. We looked at organizations we have worked with. We looked at people around us having issues in the workplace. What is causing stress? What is causing anxiety in the workplace? Can be things that are very basic. Can be like, oh my God, I have to give a presentation to my boss. Can be, oh my God, I have to write an email to my boss and this can have huge implications. And I'm really stressed about that. Can be very basic things. And it can be much more important things or much like things that have much broader implications like burnout and, people having to come out of work for a certain amount of time because they are unable to work anymore because of mental health issues. So I think we saw like a whole range of mental health issues. And very often people think about mental health, they think about all the extreme cases like burnout. And they don't think about the smaller things like, everyday stress, like the stress that they have in going into a meeting, going into work, having to speak to a colleague. And all those basic things, they look like nothing, but actually they can accumulate and lead to much more serious mental health issues. So we wrote this book for people who have already mental health awareness, but also for people who might want to develop a mental health awareness.
And I think I'll just also add, we're focusing now on, as I said, workplace stresses, but actually a lot of it is people might have stresses in their personal life, their everyday lives and things like that. And that will have an impact on work. So I suppose focusing on the self then was also thinking, when you go to work, you're not just sort of this blank sheet of paper, this blank person walking in and you're just going to take in what's happening at work and you're only going to respond to things at work. You're walking in with your whole life. You might have had an argument with your partner before you leave work. You might have been stuck in traffic and got really annoyed at somebody on the road, and you're bringing that into work. So I think it was really useful to start with the self, because it was almost thinking, okay, what am I bringing into this environment to begin with? And then what is also impacting me individually here?
And I love that, because it always struck me that this distinction that's made, like almost on the one hand, we hire people for their human attributes, the sort of skills that they bring, but we kind of like bring, and then there's this, I'll bring your whole self to work thing, but don't bring all of it for crying out. And so this perception, I think, within some organizations where you log onto the system and we'll have the nice bits of your personality and the fun, engaging bits of your brain, but can you leave that other stuff? Don't bring that into the office. We don't want any of that. You were kind of addressing that issue, because that's, I think organizations have typically struggled with that a little bit, where we want to be seen to be doing it, but it's quite difficult, quite messy. So they sort of often do performative things to try and solve the problem without addressing it. And so I love the fact that you went there and sort of said, actually, your everyday life, of course, it's weird. You can't forget about things on the outside world. And yet that's almost the way many business employer-employee relationships, well, at least they try and structure on that way.
Yeah, and I would add one thing. One other thing that convinced us to work on this is, if you think about, for example, hybrid working, one thing that I observed in some of my research that I conducted on the back of COVID was that people's work-life boundaries, their ability to distinguish their work from their personal life, was eroded. We observed people would send texts to each other after hours a lot more post-COVID than they were doing pre-COVID. And so that makes it hard for people to separate what they do at work from what they do in their personal life. And that creates what scientists call work-life spillovers, meaning you have a really bad day at work, you have a tense meeting with your boss, you go back to home and you are difficult with your partner, with your children. And inversely, you have an argument with your partner in the morning, you're going to be having difficulties at work. So you are right. Employers, they want our whole selves, but they want our whole selves only when it's a good thing, when it's, bringing our diversity, bringing our different way of thinking, bringing our loyalty. But when we bring our sick parents or, our difficulties at home into the workplace, then that's another story, because it's, employers know that this will affect performance. People might have to take days off and so on.
And you pointed a bit to the pandemic there and the challenges that, I guess, cynics that look at this space sort of say, why are people so soft these days, and very negative depictions? And my sense is, firstly, it's always been there, but secondly, the dynamics of modern day working, whether that's the technologies or the sorts of things that we're asking people to do, have made this situation worse. Is that something you'd agree with, in the sense that it's been a latent issue, but it's just been exacerbated by recent dynamics? And of course, I guess our general willingness to talk about it, awareness of what drives these issues, but it's fundamentally always been there, right?
I would agree. I think it's always been there. I think the lockdown, lots of people were sort of faced with things that maybe they weren't faced with before, or maybe they didn't have the time and space to think about before. I mean, if you think about it, if you're very busy going into the office 5 days a week, just seeing people, seeing friends, socializing, you've got a very packed life, and then all of a sudden everything stopped. That's a lot of space that we were all given to perhaps reflect and confront things that we might not have wanted to confront beforehand. And during the lockdown, I was actually working for the NHS at that point, and the number of referrals that we would see during that lockdown, it just shot right up. And again, these weren't because, all of a sudden I've locked out, we've gone into lockdown and now I'm anxious, or like, now I'm depressed. People were coming with things that they'd had for years, but it was almost like, this is the space that I can, I've got space to think about it, or actually this is when I'm confronting it, or, you know, people have sort of said to me that they're also feeling isolated and anxious, and it's made me feel brave enough to say that I can say that too and get help for it now as well.
One of the things that there are lots of books out there on mental health topics. Why is yours different?
Well, Karen and I read a lot of books about mental health in the workplace before we started pitching this book to agents and to publishers. And what we realized is a lot of those books, and still the books coming out now, they are very much about saying that well-being is important, that it has an impact on the bottom line, that there are mental health issues in the workplace. And this, honestly, we have known for the last 2 decades. And, in the last 5 years, that there are more and more mental health issues in the workplace. So mental health is an important problem for organizations. The difference with our book is that we wanted to come with something very practical that people can use on a daily basis, a set of methods, a set of approaches that they can apply to address their own mental health issues, and they can take to people in their team. And this practical element really comes from Kiran's knowledge as a counseling psychologist, because it's all of those methods that have been used and empirically proven to be successful in counseling psychology that can be insightful in terms of approaches to our own mental health challenges, our stress and our anxiety.
The book's called Wellbeing Intelligence. What does that mean?
So, we thought about mental health skills. We thought about mental health first aid. And we wanted to flesh out a new concept that will depict the way people can develop self-awareness with regards to mental health and a set of skills to help them address their mental health, and how this can inform their relationship with others in the workplace, with their teams and with their organization. And so, we are all familiar with the concept of emotional intelligence, the Dan Goleman concept, which is basically the idea that everything is rooted in self-awareness, and that with self-awareness, we can develop better skills to interact with others. And so well-being intelligence is really extrapolating that idea into the context of mental health. But why do we not call this mental health intelligence? One of the important things that I learned from Kiran and from the field of counseling psychology is that it's very difficult to disentangle mental health from physical health. And in a lot of cases, mental health issues, they manifest themselves into our physical well-being. Could be, you have like sweaty palms, could be that you are fidgeting. All of those are physical manifestation of a mental health problem or mental health challenge. And so we wanted to call this well-being intelligence to signal the holistic element, meaning that very often we need to connect those physical clues with our mental health state. And the mental health state is often what is under the water. That's the underwater part of the iceberg. And the physical part is the outer part. And so we need to connect the two to be able to address mental health issues. And so we wanted to have a concept that was holistic and that really signaled the idea that we need to first be aware of our own mental health to be able to better help others.
And I think what I'd also just add to that is why we're maybe not just focusing on mental health, we're focusing on well-being, is because also well-being could mean lots of things. People talk about like financial well-being or spiritual well-being as well. And all of these things can have an impact on maybe the level of stress that we're feeling. So it might be a mental health difficulty that we're sort of struggling with, and that can affect our well-being. But it could also be, actually, I don't know if I can pay my rent this month, and that's stressing me out as well. And I think also it makes it feel perhaps a little bit more palatable to capture this as well-being and make it a little bit more holistic, because, for a lot of people, when they're stressed, they're not going to automatically say, oh, that's anxiety, I am an anxious person. It might just be, right now I feel stressed, and that feels like something I need to address for my well-being, as opposed to, oh, I'm anxious, I might have a mental health difficulty, a mental health disorder, I need to get treatment, I need to do this, and kind of see it as a problem, I suppose, as opposed to something that might just be circumstantial.
And in the book, you have a framework. Talk us about how you went about defining that, because you ended up somewhere incredibly practical, but there was obviously the research hinterland. I'd expect nothing less from an academic. Obviously, you've read the research behind it. But what was the thinking in terms of creating that framework? How did you distill all of that?
Yes. So the framework really is this idea of well-being intelligence concentric circles. Is you start with the self, and then you can help your teams, and then you can help your organization design the well-being practices or the interventions that really are effective for your context. So I think the way we designed that was a way to structure the book as well. And the book starts with all the methods, all the practices that you can apply to yourself. And a lot of the work we have done in the book is based on collaboration we have had in the last few years. So Kiran and I had a piece in Harvard Business Review, a piece in MIT Sloan Management Review, which kind of like were built up towards the book. And in counseling psychology is very individual focused. So it's very much about how do you help people with their mental health. So Kiran does that on a daily basis. And she shared with me the methods that are being used in that field. And there is a lot of research showing the effectiveness of cognitive behavioral therapy. And for example, this is used in the NHS quite commonly. But, it is more than just a method. It's just really more broadly a mindset, an approach of connecting the physical elements, the mental health element, and really trying to take perspective on this. And so that was for the individual level. And then my expertise kicks in. Oh, the baby has woken up. The baby has
Love
woken
it. Love it. Love it. We're just going to keep recording because that's in keeping with the spirit of what you talk about in the book.
Yes. So the baby is also very good well-being intelligence. And so the team element and the organizational element is really when my perspective comes in, because my work as an organizational sociologist, as a management academic, is to help people manage their team and manage their organization. And there are lots of takeaways from the individual level that you can take to better understand why are people in your teams stressed or anxious. And in particular, on the back of the COVID pandemic, there was a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety around the COVID pandemic, around people's personal situation, around the organizational implications of COVID. And so we can see that there were spillover. They were learning that people could have at the individual level that could help them be better manager, and also see when people are struggling and then come to them with help. And similarly, the ability to learn from ourselves when it comes to designing practices in the organization, designing a culture that really is conducive of positive well-being.
And what it struck me as I was reading the book was, in many respects, if we were trying to design, and I don't just mean the type of work that people do, but also the business structures, incentives, we might even say the working week, look at those sort of, it's almost like we've designed something that I'm not sure it ever was fit for purpose entirely, but it's almost like by design, we've given ourselves greater problems with regard to this space than I think, one, are necessary, but two, than we might have realized.
Yes. So one thing that we think is an important takeaway of the book for organizations, for chief people officer, for HR in general, is that organizations in the last decade or so, they have developed great approaches to dealing with serious mental health issues like burnout or stress and anxiety when they pop out, when they are visible. But actually, there's a lot you can do upstream. You can do a lot by addressing the culture, by helping people build awareness of mental health, fight the stigma around mental health, which can then address issues when they are just small problems, like a little bit of stress, a little bit of anxiety, cultural element that drives those issues. And so the argument we develop in the book is firms, organizations are way too focused on interventions at downstream when things have got bad, and they don't think about what they can do to change their culture, to help people have better work-life boundaries, to ensure people take holidays. All of those elements that actually are quite important, but are often forgotten in well-being strategies. And in fact, you see that a lot of well-being interventions, and there is a lot of research on that, it shows that they are not very effective because people don't engage with it, because they don't think they have mental health issues. If you don't build the awareness of smaller mental health issues, they are not going to engage with mental health interventions in organizations.
When we think about the way businesses look after their other assets, you wouldn't have robots in a factory that you didn't ever service, because that they will break down at some point. And what I think is really interesting about what you've just depicted there is it's kind of like, we'll just let the humans tick over and, oh, something really bad's happened. We'd better intervene now. But as you say, there were plenty of opportunities and what I like as well about the way is that you point to a lot of the warning signs that are there. So it's not as if so some of it is invisible, but a lot of it isn't. And so really it sort of struck me that in many respects, there's a business logic to this, which is quite simply, if our people are our biggest asset type narrative. Well, if they are an asset, then look at them like any other asset that requires regular maintenance and looking after them and not waiting for things to go wrong, but preempting it. And what I really liked was, as I read it, I thought this isn't just a sort of nice to have logic, or we should be nice to our people because it's the right thing to do. There's a fundamental business logic that underpins this.
Yes, and I'm glad you're talking about robots. So I just want to do a small digression, but I promise it's related.
Digress away.
Is the rise of AI. And so I've written a little bit about this. Now we have a body of work, a body of research telling us that the more people engage with Gen AI at work, the worse for their mental health. In fact, there is research showing that people have insomnia issues, they have alcoholism issue, the more they engage with Gen AI at work, because it isolates them. It creates some degree of loneliness. If when you have a question at work, you ask Gen AI, you actually, disconnect yourself from others. While if you ask someone who is at the desk next to you, you benefit yourself, and this person who will answer your question also, they benefit themselves, and you create a social connection at work. So I think that issue is an issue that is ignored from most of Gen AI strategies in organizations. They are thinking, oh, this is a great tool. It will generate more productivity. It was the same story with hybrid working. So let's all embrace this. Let's, go full on with Gen AI. But actually, there are many implications at the individual level, many risks that are not considered and not mitigated at this stage. And organizations, they're going to chip in, they're going to step in when problems are becoming too difficult to address already. And so the assumption that we're all robots is also the assumption that we can all work in silo independently from each other. That's not how organizations create value.
As you were talking there, the narrative it's almost a sort of efficiency module. How do we get the most out of people, right? How do we get the quickest return on investment? So the more hours we can get, historically it's been the more hours we can get them to work, the more productivity we get out of them. So it's a very sort of industrial logic, if you like. And what you're pointing at, and I think as we think about technologies, is to say, well, actually, if we're employing people for their human attributes, then we need to recognize that, that's not something you can produce 24/7. But that requires downtime and that requires stepping away. So actually, to get the best out of people for the reasons that you hire them now. So even if you bought the technology will do all the simple stuff and the repeat predictable stuff, there's a point that actually says, in order to get whether it's creativity or the human touch, all these attributes that we know that the AI can't yet deliver, probably will never be able to deliver. In order for those to be maximized, people need that extra capacity. We need spare time. We need to recognize human inefficiencies.
Yes, exactly. And that's a debate with the 4-day work week. The 4-day work week is a great idea. So far, we don't have a lot of evidence that it works, but it's based on the assumption that people can cut the slack, and whatever time they waste at work, or they waste, between comma, that they waste at the water cooler or ranting about their boss, we can cut that and rise productivity. The reality that Slack might be playing a role into, helping people with their mental health, into helping people be more productive when they get back to their desk. And so we assume a linear function, a linear connection between the time we spend at work and productivity. But actually, it's a lot more complex than that. And firms need to be reminded this element if they want to get the best out of their worker. And if you think about burnout, who is burning out first? Usually it's your most engaged workers. And the people who burn out, then they become unable to contribute. And then the workload is passed on to someone else. Usually organizations have very little time to cope with that. And that creates some kind of contagion effect where you might be losing your best people really quickly because of one person burning out.
And you've mentioned this before, there are lots of practical models in the book. So you do talk big picture about the challenges, but you go into practicals. And the one, I don't know why, this really resonated to me, was the sieve model. That I just really like. I think partly in its simplicity. Can you just explain that just as an illustration of the sorts of things that are in the book?
Yeah, the sieve model is basically this idea of trying to catch up mental health issue before they become too serious. So it's about detecting and preempting. So instead, if you are an organization, what are the typical mental health interventions? You provide to your employees access to some apps, mindfulness apps, maybe some counseling services that's becoming more and more common. You give them training in the best case. So all of those are really important. But what we know is engagement with those are not necessarily very high because people don't think they are exposed to mental health issues in many cases. So what do you need? You need, upstream to have a culture where people know what is a mental health issues. They are open to talk about it with their colleagues, and they build practices and norms that enable them to really protect their personal life, have some kind of balance between their work and their personal life, have, a culture of care, and they are able to detect when people are struggling, and they are able to tackle those issues before they become too serious.
I'd also just add about one of the things that can be quite important, and when you're talking about sort of connection and things that AI can't give, is that we're hoping that part of wellbeing intelligence is about empowering teams as well, thinking like, oh, okay, yes, I've got to sort of look after my own mental health and my own wellbeing, but like you say, making it the norm within teams to, ask your colleague, how are they? Even just ask, what did you do on the weekend? Just something that's maybe not work related, but just reinforces that human connection and just sort of reminds them, we are here together. I might see you more than I see my own family members when I'm here 5 days a week. And it's important to recognize those relationships in work because they can be so protective. And actually, when we're talking about productivity and maybe kind of employee retention, having a good team is amazing because, you hear lots of people who don't want to move jobs because of the people they work with, or that's why I come to work. I come to work because the people I work with they're amazing. And, they're the ones that kind of get me out of the door in the morning.
And it struck me as you were talking about the sort of solutions that companies typically bring in. I mean, a lot of those are kind of, cool, we spend some money on this thing, buy something in. And so a lot of them are, I'm not saying they're not valuable in of themselves, but they're often quite performative, right? We have paid for everybody to have access to this and therefore job done. Right, probably. So it's almost like other dynamics that we see within an organization, whether that's whistleblowing, trying to encourage that. It's we've put in place a whistleblowing line that should solve that particular problem. And so I loved it when you were talking here, and those examples that Kiran's just given are great because I think that's sort of going, yeah, sure. I'm not saying don't do those things, but I'm saying that's not the only solution. And it's almost like if you're just buying something in, we'll just give you access to this thing, job done. That's kind of missing the point because what you're talking about here is embedding this stuff into the DNA of the organization, right? So those discussions, if human beings don't make the time to have those discussions, they're not going to happen. And that's not something you could sort of mandate that, but actually it needs to come, but people will feel that. So in many respects, what you're talking about is this needs to be authentically embedded in the way that we do business.
Yes, and let me give you an example of a firm I worked with recently. I hope they won't recognize themselves. But, some organizations have issues with their mental health. And as you say, they, splash out resources. They say, we're going to go all in. We're going to provide counseling services. Everybody will have 1 hour of counseling a month. They go mental, they invest massive amount of money. And then they're like, oh my God, this didn't yield any result. People are still, super stressed. We still have a burnout issue. What is going on? And the issue is their culture, is that they have a culture of overwork and they are not tackling that fundamental problem. So they are basically, as one would say, putting a plaster on a wooden leg. They they basically try to, I don't know, this is a French expression. I don't know if it's...
It works beautifully. I've never heard it before, but it works beautifully. We all know what you mean.
But yeah, basically it's the idea that you tackle the downstream, you try to address burnout, but actually your culture is the real problem. That people are unable to take holidays, they are unable to disconnect from work, and they are so loyal, so engaged with work that they just burn out. They go full on. And so the problem here is a cultural issue, and that's much harder to change than setting up a new intervention with like counseling services or things like that. So organizations are afraid to tackle cultural problems because it's, they are afraid they will lose their competitive advantage. If people have this culture of overwork, of going beyond the call of duty, you don't want to lose that. But actually, you may want to soften the edge if you want people to work at their best and remain in the organization instead of having a high turnover, because people get so tired of working for you, then 2 years down the line, they have to take a 1 year sabbatical in the Maldives to, to recharge their battery.
It's striking as you just depict it in that way, and obviously we're not. I'm moving us away from the realms of the company that you didn't want to identify, understandably. And sort of thinking, whenever organisations do these things where they spend a ton of money on an initiative, it's particularly when it relates to human beings at the end of it, you can sort of sense the inauthenticity of it, because you sort of go, why are they okay? So they've recognised there's a problem, and their solution to that problem is to sort of outsource it, if you like. We'll plug something in, we'll put the plaster on. And the bit I find interesting is that might be part of the solution, but if you don't have the other bit, the sorts of things you were talking about in the book, it kind of like they really don't get it. They don't understand this. It doesn't actually change anything fundamental. It might stop the proverbial wooden leg from bleeding to the extent that it does, but it doesn't. We can. I guess my point is humans are sentient, so we can recognize this stuff. And so people will not just see what you do, but will have a view on your motivations for doing it. And so my argument would be with something like that you've just talked about, actually the risk is if you just do that, and that's all you do to try and solve the problem, it almost signals a lack of seriousness. And so actually you could end up making it worse, because you could sort of go, this is the sort of place where they don't care. So even though you spent the money in a way that doesn't really solve the problem, and people kind of know it's not solving the problem, and people recognize the thing you were talking about. So what I think is interesting here is that you could really invest a ton of money and not only not solve the problem, but you could make it worse. Whereas what you're talking about here is much harder. It probably costs less money. It might cost a little bit in terms of less productivity, because, hey, God forbid, people are stepping away from work to have sort of private conversations that have nothing to do with work. How does that help us? But actually, it's a much more effective way of investing. And I think that, for me, that comes down to, if you're going to bring a strategy in that is designed to improve things for humans and improve human interactions and all those sorts of things, then it has to feel to humans like you're taking it seriously. And because we're sentient, we can recognize that.
Yes, you need coherence and you need consistency. If people feel like you have like a counseling service, but at the same time, you don't let your people take holidays, they will see the inconsistency, and they will see it's the organization is being a hypocrite and not really trying to align culture with practices. So I completely agree with you. I think it's about your ability to have a strategy with regards to well-being, not just interventions.
And the interesting thing about all of this stuff is it requires, you talk in the book about you need to know yourself. I think the quote is, know yourself to help others and foster positive change, is the motto that you talk about. And I guess what a lot of this points towards is being more human and more honest about the world. And yet, if we look at a lot of organizations where, the tendency towards spin doctrine, to talk about how great things are, let's not talk about failings. We can sort of see that in the world today, there's a reluctance to admit things have gone wrong. And we can see that within organizations. But we also see individuals. How are you? Very British thing. How are you? Oh, I'm fine. Fine, thanks. Right. There could be horrible things going on, but we daren't tell anybody else that because it's embarrassing. And that's really the core of what you're pointing at here, is we need a little bit more honesty around this stuff if we really want to address this issue. But that's quite challenging.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's really challenging to do that because of all the reasons you said. Like, it can feel embarrassing, can feel really, really vulnerable, but at the same time, not talking about it is so silencing. And in the book, we talk about how to have a well-being conversation, we call it, but really it's just about having an honest conversation. It's just asking someone how they are, but waiting for an honest answer or trying to really listen for that honest answer. And it can feel really daunting to do that, I think, and especially daunting to do that in a workplace where typically, we're not really going to talk about things that aren't work related. Or when we go to work, we want to kind of present our most professional self. So why would I put myself in a position where I'm going to be really vulnerable now and tell you that actually things aren't going very well? And what are you going to think of me? Are you going to think I'm not as effective at work because of this? But it's really important. It's like you say, bringing that honesty is really useful. One, because it might be the first time someone's felt able to maybe acknowledge how they're feeling, or that might be the first time that they're having some sort of well-being conversation. So that might mean that they're in a better position to get help and support. But also it helps with that buy-in within the organization. If we've got people in the organization starting to have these conversations, be it across team members, or maybe your manager starts asking these questions, it does bring in that a little bit more of that buy-in, and hopefully does change that culture, does sort of bring that investment, and that will hopefully pay off.
And I think you refer to the British culture. So as an outsider, I can talk about that. But I think one of the important message in our book is we're telling people, don't only pay attention to your mental health when it is becoming critical. You need to really look for the smaller cues and try to better understand why you're experiencing those small episodes of stress, or even the smaller things, they do matter and they might accumulate. And we're saying we need to pay attention to the smaller thing, and we need to talk about mental health and destigmatize it if we want to be able to create this awareness for small things before they become too serious.
And how do you see this fitting into incentive models and other corporate structures? Because obviously for this to sort of take hold is organizations need to recognize that this is important. And yet I would struggle to see, let's imagine somebody working in sales. You could see that the answer is the way you're rewarded is the more you sell, the bigger the bonus you get, right? Or the less likely you are to lose your job, whichever way end of the spectrum you want to look at it from. And so to introduce this, you could see that could be quite challenging for organizations, because you're pointing to something that doesn't appear. It's almost like the short-term thinking is this is going to cost us in the short term, right? But your point is in the longer term, this makes much more sense because you don't get burnout and all these other sorts of challenges. Do you see many of the structure, again, back to the structures that we have in place, as being, in a way, you're challenging those a little bit as well and saying that we need to have other factors that are brought in? Because if the overriding thing is people are bonus, I can think of financial services as an example, but there are plenty of other industries where bonuses play a key role. If your bonus is just skewed towards business success, you could see this not, even if the organization said it was important, the incentive program speaks quite loud volumes. How do you see that tension being managed?
Yeah, I think it's a classic short-term, long-term issue as well. If you think about remote work, what we observed in our work is that when you look at the national statistics, there was a peak in productivity when we all shifted to remote work. So we gained in productivity, but there was a cost on the longer run. And I think that's the same idea. You might be a very, very good salesperson, and you might go all in, be super engaged, but how long can you actually sustain that? If you can sustain that for a year and then you burn out and you have to change jobs because you have gone crazy, because it was so much work that you couldn't disconnect and you just couldn't take a break from your engagement with the organization, then the organization is losing one of their best person. They are losing someone who was highly productive because they haven't helped them set up the right guardrail to protect themselves and also to pace themselves out. And the reality is that it's better to have consistent high performance on a longer run than very high performance on a shorter run that then creates turnover. So that's one rationale for organization. But there is another element, which is how do we create incentives for people to highlight mental health as an important outcome? And you have a lot of discussions in the literature on the well-being economy, for example, how we can think about well-being as an important outcome rather than profit. But the reality is that there are lots of connections between performance in the longer run and well-being. And that means that for managers, you need to create some forms of incentives to ensure that they provide support, that they're able to help their people, and to highlight that by supporting people in their team, they will have more stability in their team, less turnover, more loyalty, more engagement that will then pay off in terms of performance, maybe not on the very short term, but on the midterm horizon.
And I guess a key function of this is talking about it. It's the classic thing about things that we don't talk about become big problems. Not just individuals should be talking about it, but the organizations should be upfront about this and say, this is what we believe in. And therefore, the sorts of investors you want ought to be investors that would want that, because we're thinking longer term.
Yes, and there are many hidden costs to well-being, and organizations, they forget about that. But if you have a culture of overwork, some people might select themselves into working for you, but you might have a turnover issue. So people might develop a lot of idiosyncratic knowledge and capacity with your organization, and then they might leave. that is actually very costly. And that's not an obvious cost that will, appear in your quarterly earning, but the reality is that it's affecting them on the longer run. So I think that's quite an important issue. And the other issue that you are raising is monitoring, transparency. And I have worked with many organizations in the last couple of years that are trying to better capture well-being. And they have tried many different things. A lot of organizations, they have pulse surveys, they have ways to try to capture mental health issues, and pockets within the organizations that are facing maybe more pressure and have more mental health challenges. So organizations are trying to better monitor it, but it comes with a lot of challenges. People are overburdened with answering surveys. They don't necessarily, they just tick the boxes. So it's about this balance of trying to get people to raise attention to mental health issues while not having them overburdened with survey, taking survey and so on.
And it struck me that one of the challenges here is that the narrative is very much around you either have mental health issues or you don't. And it always struck me that we all do on some level. Nobody has an absolutely perfect world where everything goes accordingly, that has zero stress whatsoever. It is because even if you looked at who might that be, well, people with loads of money in theory, but that brings its own stresses. And so it always struck me that actually, when we talk about this thing, it's kind of like it's binary. You've either get issues or you haven't. And this is why thinking about oneself, if we're all honest with ourselves, we all go through those moments, those hideous moments. So even if our lives are pretty good, actually we can have that. And it struck me that the sort of thing that we ought to be moving towards is to have a thing that sort of says, well, everybody at some point goes through this, right? So it's not like you're suddenly in the camp of people that has an issue, whereas everybody else is the normal people don't, if you like. And so it struck me that we could shift a little bit. And that's why I think it's healthy to think about ourselves and recognize that, on some level, and it might be what we classic sort of first world problems, in my case, very privileged, don't generally have major issues, but still, they're on some level, I'm going to find myself, even if it's not all the time, there are going to be times when I'm under stress. And so what I thought you were pointing towards this thing is to sort of recognize that it affects all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's hard when we do sort of have that very black and white thinking of like, oh, you either have a mental health difficulty or you don't. And that's it. But actually, we all have a mental health in the same way we talk about physical health. Like we all have a physical health. Sometimes it might be better, sometimes it's not. We go on holiday, you think about Christmas and New Year and we're drinking all of that. Our physical health probably isn't so great. Maybe our mental health is better at that point. Who knows? But, it will go up and down. Our physical health goes up and down depending on what we're doing. And our mental health is the same. It's not that because our life is great that we don't have a mental health. So I think you're right in terms of like basically, sort of saying this is something we all have. This is important. It's not something we, just the normal people might not have to deal with. And the people who have them do have to deal with. So I think it is important to bring that into the conversation. But also, I know we focused on things like mental health stressors and challenges and perhaps the more distressing experiences that we might have. But equally, when we're at work, we're allowed to talk about mental health and well-being in a way that it feels good. Like, oh, actually, I really enjoyed working on that project. Like it gave me such a boost. I want to do more of that. Or actually, I had such a great weekend. I managed to get out and about and enjoy the sunshine. Like that's also talking about well-being and mental health, and maybe in a way that might feel a little bit more agreeable to some people who are a bit more adverse to, I don't want to talk about how I'm doing if it's bad, or, it could be a good starting point for people perhaps to maybe just start by being really honest about how they are. And I'm going to be honest about the good bits first and just see how that feels.
I love that. It's very simple, but you're right. It's almost like if there's a discussion of mental health, it has to be a pity party wherever, let me see if I can bring something that's worse than your challenges. And actually stress can be positive. So we always think about distress, but there's eustress, the other. So I love that idea of thinking it's not all there's an emotional roller coaster that we all go through. But what a great way to frame it. Is they will bring some positives as well. But you don't have to pretend everything's positive. But I think if we can't talk about the positives, then the negatives, then it becomes a gloomy conversation all the time.
Yeah, and people get sort of put off by that, and it's quite daunting. And like you say, sometimes we can fall into this trap of like, oh, that person's going through like so much. What I'm going through might not compare. And, that can be really silencing, and kind of people feel like, oh no, what I'm thinking, it's not bad enough. It's fine. I just need to get over it. And that sort of thinking does just prevent us from ever opening up then.
Speaking of sort of mixed emotions, what was it like writing the book? But one, the subject, but two, writing together?
Who wants to start with that?
Well, we are not divorced and we have a baby together. So I think it went better than with many other quarters I have had in my career. No, I think, it's an interesting experience. Maybe you are familiar with that book by the Petriglieri couple about couples that work. And we often forget when we are, in a couple, in a partnership, that very often we have complementary assets and complementary skills. And that complementary skills can always produce something that is unique and adds value. And so, this was a good experiment. And I learned a lot from another field than mine. I'm hoping Kiran did learn a little. She's saying yes, no, but maybe not. I don't know. But I think we often forget that there are complementary assets in the couple as a structure, and that there is a lot to learn in working together. No, I think you were very productive.
I think so. And actually, it's quite interesting. One, yes, of course, I did learn lots from you as well. But also that idea of work-life balance when you're working with somebody in your personal life is quite interesting
That's
as well.
where I was going with the question.
Yeah,
Right?
absolutely. It was quite interesting. It would be sort of, we'd have to consciously make an effort of like, okay, like today we're going to work on this part of the book, or actually I need to have a conversation about what you wrote here and can you explain it to me? But then also thinking, actually, let's go and do something that's not related to the book. Let's go and do something as a couple now. And, let's almost just bracket this for now and come back to it. But it did feel like we had to make a conscious effort to do that, because otherwise I think we would have just been very guilty of having this work-life spillover that we're trying to, educate people about and sort of help them manage. And we would have been massive hypocrites otherwise. So, yeah.
And two other things, people don't always know that we are a couple. So when sometimes we do talks, and then they realize we are a couple, so that's always quite funny. But I think another thing with working together is, obviously this gave us a project that we worked on together. But once we were done, and book cycles are very long, so we actually finished writing this book maybe a year and a half ago. And we had written papers together as well. But once we were done, we were a little bit like, oh my God, what now? So fortunately, our child came up, and so we had a
We
new
solved that problem by other means.
Destiny solved that problem for us. But it was quite interesting. Yeah, doing something together is, once this is done, what is next?
Yeah. And I'm hoping that the experience of writing a book together and working with each other in that way will hopefully make us better sort of co-parents in that sense, because we've had a lot of experience just, well, I suppose interacting with each other in a different ways as opposed to a couple, so sort of with a working relationship. So I don't know, maybe I'm being very naive and thinking, oh, now that's going to make everything easy. Wishful thinking.
Right, but I love, but you embraced the spirit of the question, which was exactly that, which was you have brought work home in a really interesting way, and broken lots of dividing lines. And so I think it's just a fascinating experiment. You are still smiling and doing a great job of looking like it's all under control. So I wondered, is there another book in the offing? Is there sort of part 2 of this? Any plans on that front, or is it far too early to say because you've got other things to concentrate on?
I think in an ideal world, I think we'd always be open to doing something else and doing something else together. But practically right now, probably it's a little bit tricky.
Well, you could wait a few years and then 3 of you could write a book.
That's a good point.
Possibly. He has been smiling during the whole podcast, so I think he really liked what we were talking about. He liked your questions as well. He was smiling at your question.
Laughing at them, Thomas, obviously, right?
Yes, laughing enthusiastically. He thought your jokes were excellent. And so, no, I think you're right that it is an interesting experience, because obviously, if you bring your work at home, this work-life boundary is not the same. But that's why this project never really felt like work. It felt like a side project, a side adventure for our couple. It never felt like work, and that's the best thing when work feels like fun. That's the when you produce the most interesting, the most unique type of work.
And it's kind of interesting because both of you, I'm guessing, right? Both of you have careers that you have to love to do because of the sort of the fixed cost of getting where you get to, the commitment it involves, all those sorts of things. And so one of the things I would have sort of wondered is to say, well, actually, what does this break a winning formula? Because you're stepping out, but just looking at the way you're interacting with each other, thinking about it, and the subject you've chosen, actually, it's not too. You haven't gone off and written a novel together. You've pulled those resources, and so it's both of you bringing something that you love from the outside world into the domestic arena, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think it's also a way to, I mean, the strength of the book is the complementarity between our two perspectives. And obviously, if we hadn't worked on the book, I wouldn't have learned about all those techniques in counseling psychology that Kiran uses on a daily basis. And similarly, Kiran might not, have thought about all those organizational perspectives on well-being. So very often we forget that the people we live with, the people we interact with on a daily basis, actually they have a lot of complementary knowledge that can really inform our own view and our own approach to the world and what we actually bring back to the workplace, bring back in our. So some of the stuff that I've learned from Kiran, I've brought this into my leadership MBA class in the university. I hope, I don't know if there's anything.
No, absolutely. I feel like working on this and learning from your perspective it also, I suppose, refreshed the way I looked at my work. And, for me, a lot of the things that we've talked about in the book, I've been doing them in practice with individuals in therapy for so long. For me, I'm almost like, oh, this is just, automatic. It's common sense. Of course, I would think like this. Who wouldn't think like this? So it was actually really interesting then to see it from like Thomas' perspective and think like, oh, actually, this is quite special. Like, this is a unique way of thinking. And actually, there's a lot of value to this and not everybody knows this. So for me, I think it almost like renewed my passion in what I do on a day-to-day basis, which I think was incredible.
And I love that idea of stuff that we take for granted. And we can put that in the sort of curse of knowledge bucket, but we can also just sort of, I don't know, things that we've just got used to and ways of doing things and ways of working. And so I love that when you bring two disciplines together and it's sort of like somebody sees tremendous value in something that you take for granted and vice versa. I think that's quite empowering and exciting.
We hope so. Yeah.
And so we talked about this before we started recording. So I said to you, I was a bit surprised in a very positive sense that The Economist had picked this up as a book, because if you'd asked me what sort of books does The Economist publish, I would have said it would be more about shareholder value. And in fact, many of the things that we've talked about as potentially not helping the dynamics that you're trying to resolve. And you came up with a great answer, Thomas, which I'd love to explore a little bit as to why actually it makes sense for The Economist to be your publisher.
Yeah, so this is published in the Economist Edge series. And you're right that The Economist as an outlet is very focused on shareholder value. But I think well-being maybe, was not perceived as something aligned with shareholder value maybe 10 years ago. But increasingly, I think because of the implication of the COVID pandemic, of the global state of the world, which is a stressful world to live in, a lot of organizations and media believe that there is shareholder value in well-being as well, and that we can create shareholder value by paying attention to well-being. I'm not saying necessarily this is the best well-being we're going to create if we only focus on shareholder value. There is a complex link as we explored. Sometimes it's the short-term, long-term element. Sometimes it's hidden cost of well-being. But I think organizations and media and advocates of the shareholder value are becoming more aware that there is shareholder value in well-being.
And I think for me, the interesting bit is just the existence of the book. So I was thinking as you were talking, just the fact the book's there, right? Having the book around in the office, right, is a powerful. So it's a physical manifestation of a sort of a view of the world that I think is interesting. And so even the fact that it's published by The Economist is illustrative of a shifting of perhaps the shift, whatever the equivalent of the Overton window is. It's shifting slightly, and so I think that's a very powerful thing. As ever, Thomas, when I talk to you, and Kiran, you've added to that, so thank you. Time has just flown. It's been absolutely fascinating. I love the book, so thank you for writing it. But before I let you go, remind people, we know who it's published by, but remind people what it's called.
It's called Wellbeing Intelligence, Building Better Mental Health at Work. And it's coming out on 17th of July. And I agree with the last point you made that, just having this into the office is a game changer. So people can definitely buy the book. Just, let it sit on their office desk, and this will have a magical impact on, on mental health and well-being. So I loved your marketing plot. It was very good.
And of course, we'll also recognise that you being French, August is generally a month when nothing much happens. So it's also perfect for taking on the beach, I would argue.
Yes, the beach, the swimming pool, your August retreat. I agree, and a lot of research is telling us that holidays are highly beneficial and you become more productive when you come back to work. So the French, got it right all along.
That wonderful note, Thomas, Kiran, and the third guest on the show. Thank you so much. One, for writing a fabulous book. It is genuinely great, comes highly recommended. But secondly, for being super engaging and fun people, and for helping me break a brand new record on the show of having a silent guest on along with us. Thank you for all of that. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So that's it for this episode of the show. My enormous thanks to Thomas and to Kiran for appearing, and of course to you for listening. To find out more about both of them, their brand new book, Wellbeing Intelligence, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those. You'll also find the link to Thomas' previous appearance on the show, where we talked about the surprising upside of stigma and negative perception. Well worth checking out if you haven't heard it. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, where have you been? But thank you so much for joining me. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show and have yet to leave a review for it, please do so wherever you download your podcast. It really, really does help. It allows other people to find the show and ensures that the platforms give greater prominence to it than they would otherwise. That's helpful to allow me to continue to do it. To discover episodes of the show that you might have missed, visit the show's website, which is humanriskpodcast.com. There's something there for everyone. And there are over 333 episodes that I've now recorded. I will be back very soon with another episode of this show with some fabulous guests. But in the meantime, stay safe, look after your mental health, and perhaps practice a little bit of well-being intelligence of your own. And whatever you're doing this summer, thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you very soon on another episode of the Human Risk Podcast.